Do we all secretly want the world to end? I mean, not intentionally, not as part of some shady corporate conspiracy, but somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the doom scrolling, the slow creep of everything getting worse, is there a part of us that just thinks, bugger it, blow it all up already? Because Fallout is back. Season 2 just dropped, and I love it. I'm right back in the Wasteland, scavenging through the ruins, laughing at things I shouldn't, and feeling good. And it's not just me. Whether it's the games or the show, a lot of us are choosing to spend our free time in a world of radroaches, raiders, and a spicy New Vegas robot called Fisto. And it keeps bringing me back to the same uncomfortable question. What if the Wasteland isn't actually a nightmare? What if on some level it's a holiday? I mean, not from danger, of course, but from everything else. From the inbox, the algorithms, the vague sense that we're failing at 17 things simultaneously, that we're surrounded by systems that don't necessarily kill us, like Dead Money style, but don't quite let us live either. Whereas in Fallout, all of that is gone. And what's left is simple. Find water, find food, find shelter, survive, and travel with companions who actually have our back. You know, once we finish their tragic backstory missions, of course. And apparently that's so appealing that we'll binge it, we'll replay it, and we'll build cosplay power armors in our garage to celebrate it. What I think we're feeling is a longing to call in sick from a civilization that won't stop calling. Fallout lets us imagine what that might look out without having to actually burn everything down. But here's the thing, maybe we don't need the bombs to live differently. Maybe that's something that we can start doing right now. Because underneath the sarcasm, the satire, and the sawn-off shotguns, I think Fallout has a hidden message. So today I want to trace how we ended up laughing our heads off at exploding heads, how the apocalypse went from humanity's greatest fear to something we watch for comfort, what that says about the world that we are actually living in, and whether Fallout, underneath the vault suits, the riot gear, and the sexy sleepwear, might actually be pointing us towards something we deeply need. So welcome back to Philosophical TV Club. Let's plug in our Pip-Boys, open that vault door, and see what horrors await us inside. But before we trace how we got here, we should talk about why Fallout is such a good test case for this question. Because Fallout isn't just another post-apocalyptic story. Most apocalypse fiction, at least from where I'm sitting, seems interested in the moment of the collapse and its immediate aftermath. But almost uniquely, Fallout is interested in something slightly different. It wants us to know what was already broken before the bombs fell, and what parts of that broken system people either cling to still or simply carry on like an indestructible radroach into the post-apocalypse. In the world of Fallout, a certain sort of 1950s American optimism and propaganda is amplified to a ridiculous degree, literally and metaphorically piped into the wasteland by patriotic iBots. The retro-futuristic aesthetics, you know, those chrome diners, the atomic-powered cars, and the buzzsaw-wielding Mr. Handys, all embody the earnest belief that science and industry would deliver us all a better tomorrow, while in their rusted, irradiated state also communicate the irony of such a blind hopefulness. In Fallout, it's always a cover for something darker and something far more cynical, but it's also clear that almost everyone in that Fallout universe bought into it, right up until the fateful 23rd of October 2077, when the bombs finally fell. It's almost as if to make life tolerable in Fallout's before world, everybody had to believe that things were getting better and better, even while they were objectively getting worse and worse, which sounds alarmingly familiar. Because in the world of Fallout, outside of the billboards and the sugar bomb cereal boxes, all of the resources ran out, and our governments pretty much gave up. Instead, there were corporations like Vault-Tec and Robco, who stepped into the gap, selling survival as a consumer product while quietly running experiments on the people they promised to protect. And Fallout is kind of what happens when you let the most cynical forces of our own world, things like corporate profit, short-termism, collective gain without individual responsibility, or allowing marketing to replace the truth, run wild and have their way without opposition. I think the genius of the games is in showing us both faces, the before and the after. For example, the before is the cute retro thirst sapper that you pick up in Nuka World, while the after is the Mad Max style Thunderdome that the Raiders have built around it. While in the moment of the actual apocalypse happening, and you can see it in Cooper Howard's shocked face when the bombs actually fall, it's all a big surprise, of course. But as a result of the systems that were left to run wild before it, the inevitable apocalypse in Fallout isn't really that surprising at all. Also, the TV series goes a little beyond the games here, showing us the contrasting, but not really that contrasting, before times through Cooper Howard's flashbacks. It's a useful device, and it lets us watch the slow rot happening in real time alongside its consequences. I'd argue it's also what makes Fallout such a good vehicle for thinking about why we love these kind of apocalypse stories. It's not interested in the end of the world as a single dramatic moment, although there is that, but rather as more of a process, a corruption that arguably started long before the missiles were launched and certainly didn't stop when they landed. The TV show also gives us 3 characters through which to process this from different angles. And I'll try to keep this as spoiler light as possible in case you haven't quite caught up with the series yet. But there's Lucy, a Vault dweller raised in the fluorescent certainty of Vault 33. Her life has been structured, optimistic, and safe in that slightly airless, bureaucratic way that utopias tend to be. Initially, she's a model for the kind of naivety and buying into the marketing blindness that basically enabled the apocalypse, along with everything else that keeps running hidden underneath it, up to and including what her own father is up to. She believes in the rules. She believes in the people in charge mostly know what they're doing, and she believes very sincerely that the world above is a temporary problem that good planning will eventually solve. When she's forced up to the surface, all of that pretty quickly starts to come apart. What begins as a rescue mission turns into a long, painful education in how the world actually ended and what kind of people let it happen. Her optimism keeps her going, but it also keeps her walking into situations where optimism is exactly the wrong tool for the job. But just like us, when we play the protagonist in the games, she adapts pretty quickly. And then there's Maximus, a soldier in the Brotherhood of Steel, one of the factions that emerged from the wreckage with big ideas about duty, honour, and the preservation of technology. The Brotherhood talks about restoring order and protecting humanity, as well as keeping dangerous knowledge out of the wrong hands. That's the lesson that they took from the mushroom clouds. But the longer Maximus spends in the field, the more he notices the gap between what the Brotherhood says and what it actually does. He's ambitious and he desperately wants to believe, but he's starting to notice that the Brotherhood's version of honour looks a lot like selective cruelty and unquestioning obedience. Every mission makes it a little harder to pretend that the Brotherhood is what it actually says it is. So here's our way into what happens when institutions survive the apocalypse, but lose whatever it was that made them worth trusting in the first place. And then there's the ghoul, Cooper Howard, the dark, cynical, beating heart of the show, and really the embodiment of the entire ethos of the games. What I loved about them, certainly. Before the war, he was many things. He was an actor, a movie cowboy, a veteran, a family man, as well as a face on Vault-Tec recruitment posters. He believed in the system, or at least he played someone who did, who had a vested interest in it, which in America is often the same thing. Then the bombs fell, and the radiation did something to him that it doesn't do to most people. It let him survive. And now really he's just one thing: vengeance on a personal quest personified. Through his flashbacks, we see the pre-World War as what it actually was. And we watch Cooper slowly realise what's happening around him, even as he keeps telling himself, it'll be fine. He remembers the world before it ended, which also means he remembers all of the moments he could have done something about it and didn't. What I think is really nice too is that these 3 characters also represent something of the Fallout game's karma system, with Lucy being the good, altruistic playthrough that some of us always insist on playing, and Cooper being the evil, self-interested one that some others of us also insist on playing. While Maximus kind of represents that playthrough where you help every one of the residents of Megaton, but you can't quite stop yourself from detonating the nuke at the heart of the city because 1,000 caps in a suite in Tenpenny Tower is just too sweet to turn down. So that's Fallout, and it brings us to the real question. If this world is so brutal, and it is, why do we find it so appealing? What does it say about us that we keep choosing to spend time here? I think to answer that, we need to understand what the apocalypse actually means, not just as a synonym for everything explodes, but as an idea with a history. Because the way we imagine the end of the world has changed dramatically over time, and those changes tell us something really important about what we're really afraid of, as well as what we're secretly hoping for. So let's start with the original and the best, the religious apocalypse, where angels trumpet, the dead rise, and some weird stuff happens with a lady of loose virtue and a many-headed beast. Then we'll move to the nuclear apocalypse and the Cold War, the moment that world-breaking power shifted into human hands, as well as the terror and hopefully the caution that came with it. Then we'll look at what happens when you live with that potentially human-induced end for just way too long and kind of start to take it for granted, not exactly believing that it won't happen, but being skeptical enough that we start making video games about an alternative future where it did. And finally, we'll arrive at the cozy apocalypse, where we are now. That strange cultural moment where the end of the world has become familiar enough that we've started to find it almost comforting. Where the nuclear wasteland can feel, against all logic, like a place we'd rather be. Because Fallout sits at the intersection of all four of these, I think. It borrows the imagery of divine reckoning while making fun of it. It lives in the shadow of the bomb while almost nostalgically missing it. It critiques the systems that failed while never quite believing that anything else was possible. And it offers us the peculiar freedom of imagining life after everything falls apart. But first, Deus Irae. And if you go back far enough, the apocalypse doesn't really look anything like Fallout. Of course it doesn't. There's no Vault-Tec, there's no corporate boardrooms deciding who gets to survive and who doesn't, and there's no slow-motion systems failure dressed up in optimistic advertising. For most of Western history, in fact, the end of the world wasn't a human screw-up at all. It was a divine event. It was something that happened to us, not something we did. The word itself also gives the game away, because apocalypsis doesn't mean planet explodes. It means unveiling or revelation, the curtain lifting on what was always true but hidden. In this older tradition, the apocalypse wasn't a disaster. It was the final chapter where God explains the whole plot for those of us who missed it. And crucially, we weren't writing it. We were just characters waiting to see how it all ended. In early Jewish and Christian traditions, that ending had a clear structure. The world as we know it ends, everyone is judged, and then a new order replaces the old forever. And that's terrifying, sure, but it's also in its own way reassuring, because all of the injustice and all of the suffering would eventually be balanced out or made good in that reading. The powerful would answer for what they've done, like burning down our farmhouses, and the meek would inherit whatever was left. St. Augustine is the one who really locks this into a philosophical framework. Writing in the early 5th century, right after the sack of Rome, he's surrounded by people who genuinely think that the world is ending. You know, the eternal city has just fallen, the barbarians are at the gates, and Christianity is being blamed for weakening the entire empire. Augustine's response in The City of God is essentially, hey guys, relax, calm down everyone, this isn't the apocalypse. He draws a distinction between the city of man and the city of God, because in his view, empires rise and fall, but it's not the end of the world. For him, Rome was never eternal, and the true story of history is bigger than any one state or country. Its ending is in God's hands, not in the Goths. And our job, according to Augustine, isn't to predict the end or panic about it, but to live faithfully in the meantime, trusting that the final judgment will come when it's supposed to. That move matters for our purposes because it establishes something important. In this worldview, history is linear and it has a destination. We're not going round in circles, we're heading somewhere, towards a moral conclusion, written by someone who knows what they're doing. In short, the end isn't random, but meaningful. And think of that from the perspective of the poor suckers who had to live through these darkest of ages. If you're living through the plague or famine or invasion or your farmhouse being burned down for the 17th gajillionth time, it tells you that, sure, this is horrible, but it isn't pointless. There will be a reckoning, and those bastards who burn down your farm will not get away with everything down here in the final chapter. They will be much worse off, with fire and pitchforks and all of that. So no wonder that kind of apocalyptic thinking stuck around for so long, because it had a kind of comforting justice all of its own. For centuries, whenever something big went wrong, like the Black Death or every damned comet in Europa Universalis or an earthquake, for example, you'd get another wave of pro-creatures proclaiming that this was the end. The end is nigh, again. And underneath all of that spectacle was the same basic structure. The apocalypse is external, scheduled, and just. It comes from above, on time, and with a purpose. You can prepare for it. You can tremble at it. You can argue about the timing, but you're not the one holding the detonator. Now, this version of the apocalypse is the one that Fallout is pretty clearly and loudly rejecting. In fact, mocking. The games and the show aren't interested in divine judgment because there is no cosmic plan in the Wasteland. There's no sense that the bombs fell for a good reason, or any suggestion that all that suffering means something. When you wander past another skeleton slumped over a desk, clutching a coffee mug they never got to finish, there's no moral to extract from it. It just happened. The universe isn't watching, and frankly, the universe doesn't care. Indeed, the closest that Fallout gets to the religious apocalypse is the Children of Atom, a cult that worships radiation itself as divine and the bomb, as well as its devastation, as sacred. For them, each detonation is a sacrament, and they talk about the glow with the kind of reverence medieval mystics reserved for the presence of God itself. And Fallout plays this for entirely dark comedy. The Children of Atom are recognisably human. They're doing what humans always do when the world stops making sense, which is to find a story and a cult that makes it make sense again. But the joke is that they're trying to import the old religious framework into a universe that clearly doesn't run on that logic anymore. They think someone is in charge. They think it all means something, and the Wasteland keeps proving them wrong. Which is precisely, I suspect, the point, and why the games love cults so much. The religious apocalypse promised that the end would be authored, that even in destruction there would be justice and meaning. Fallout strips that out. The bombs didn't fall because humanity was wicked. They fell because resources ran out, corporations lied, and nobody with enough power had any incentive to stop it. It's not a verdict, it's just a mess. But before we could get to that bleaker, more absurd version of the end, something important had to change. The apocalypse had to move out of God's hands and into our own. And that shift didn't happen overnight. Writers and philosophers had been worrying about it for a while before the technology finally caught up. Mary Shelley's The Last Man, for example, published in 1826, imagines humanity wiped out by a plague, which is a bit too close to home at the moment, with no divine judgment, no chosen remnant, and just disease and emptiness. It tanked at the time because readers found it shapeless and bleak, which we later discovered it is. And a world that ends for no moral reason felt to those readers wrong to them, almost unthinkable. But by the late 19th century, our good old friend Friedrich Nietzsche was diagnosing something similar. When he declared that God is dead, he wasn't just being provocative. He was describing that slow erosion of the framework that made the religious apocalypse meaningful in the first place. Once you stop believing in a divine author, the end of the world kind of changes character. It stops being a guaranteed act of cosmic justice and it becomes just one possible outcome amongst others. Maybe we muddle on, maybe we collapse, or maybe history doesn't end so much as just run out of steam. So the religious apocalypse kind of disappears with a whimper, remembered only by groups like the Children of Atom. And these new anxieties of Shelley and co. were real, but they were mostly theoretical. You could worry about a godless apocalypse, but you couldn't actually cause one. And then, quite suddenly, you could. Because, as we've seen for the most of history, the end of the world was something that you waited for. It arrived from the outside. But then, in a space of a few decades in the mid-20th century, that changed completely. We built the thing ourselves. Yes, the Manhattan Project, Trinity, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. These weren't just military events. They were a revolution in the nature of human power. The apocalypse moved out of God's hands and into ours. Suddenly, the end of the world wasn't a distant chapter in somebody else's book, but a button in a bunker. And we were the ones who might press it. Understandably, I think it took a while for our culture to catch up with that. Early on, there was an almost surreal attempt to fold nuclear weapons into the existing story of progress in the 1950s and early 1960s that we as a civilization were just desperate to cling to. Because how could it be that the same science that gave us antibiotics and refrigerators could also give us nuclear weapons that could vaporize a city in seconds? Now, somehow, we were supposed to hold both of these possibilities in our heads at once. We got nuclear power brochures with smiling families and the Jetsons and the Ford Nucleon. Yes, Ford promised us an honest-to-goodness nuclear fission-powered car, and you're still complaining about where's your jetpack. And at the same time, official films explaining how to hide under your school desk when the inevitable flash came.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
And that's really weird, because the religious apocalypse, well, at least that offered moral clarity, as terrible as it was. But the nuclear age could only offer us cognitive dissonance. A cognitive dissonance that Fallout, when it comes along, exploits so skillfully. People at the peak of the Cold War were living in two realities at once. On the surface, there was the suburban lawns, consumer goods, and the baby boom. The sense that history was finally going somewhere nice after a terrible world war. But underneath all of that was the knowledge that at any moment, someone in a bunker could misread a radar blip and end everything. And the feeling that this is exactly the kind of strategic miscalculation that we humans are infamous for. We can even measure that cognitive dissonance in the actual cultural artifacts from the time. As mentioned, there were the civil defense films where cartoon turtles teach children that getting under a table might save them from a thermonuclear blast, or the government pamphlets recommending that you whitewash your windows and stock canned food as if you're preparing for a slightly more explosive version of a bad storm. Then there was a roaring trade in plans and materials to build your own fallout shelter in your backyard under that lovely bed of petunias, as if it was like a nice weekend project for the whole family. And on one level, these were genuine attempts to be hopeful. But on another level, they were rituals of denial, because it's very hard to look directly at the fact that your entire way of life is now balanced on the assumption that nobody will panic or miscalculate or have a bad day at the launch console. That is exactly the territory that Fallout loves to play in, because the Vault-Tec promotional material littered throughout the games, and really the whole vibe that that underground world is modelled on, is pitch perfect Cold War civil defence in tone. It's just cranked up a few degrees past plausible. Take the opening of Fallout 4, for example, where a Vault-Tec rep shows up on your doorstep with a clipboard and a smile, cheerfully signing you up for a spot in the local vault, just in case.
Good morning! Vault-Tec calling. Why, we're about you, ma'am, and helping secure your future. You see, Vault-Tec is the foremost builder of state-of-the-art underground fallout shelters. Vaults, if you will. Luxury accommodations where you can wait out the horrors of nuclear devastation.
Tell me more about this vault.
Oh, it has all the amenities of the modern home, I assure you. Not to mention total protection from nuclear radiation and hostile mutants. A better future underground. It's not only our mission, it's our passion.
Because hey, this isn't a terrifying eventuality that you're planning for, but an exciting purchasing opportunity for peace of mind, just like a shiny new car. It's absurd and sinister and it's funny, and it's even funnier when you run into that very same salesman ghoulified later on in the game. And the reason it works is because it's not that far from the actual tone of 1950s and 60s preparedness campaigns. The message is the same. The world might end, but don't worry. Someone's got a plan, and if you fill out the right forms, you might be one of the lucky ones. Fallout just follows that logic to its darkest conclusion, because of course the corporation selling you the safety is also running experiments on you, or as we discover in the TV series, and no spoilers here, I promise, something perhaps even worse. And of course, the vaults aren't really about saving lives. And of course, the cheery instructional videos keep playing long after everyone they were made for is dead. Cooper Howard fits right into this. Before the bombs, he's a movie star and the smiling center of Vault-Tec's sales campaigns, as he's repeatedly reminded again and again in the Wasteland. He's literally selling the Cold War narrative, playing the part of the confident American who will protect his family when the time comes.
Oh, hello there. Yep, it's me, Cooper Howard, star of stage and screen. But I'm not here today to talk to you about my latest picture. No, today I'm here to show you a vast and wonderful place. Not made by God Almighty, but the working man. A veritable Camelot of the nuclear age. Now, how about we turn on some lights? There, that's better. Now, I'm speaking to you from deep inside the fully livable model 96 JQ 1164. And what a beaut she is. And what a song she sings. Now, that right there is Vault 4's 3-foot thick lead casing. Strong enough to keep out the rads and the reds.
And the show is smart about what it does with him, because Cooper isn't a villain at this point. He believes it, or at least he wants to. He's doing what millions of people did during the Cold War, which is trusting that the people in charge have it under control and that their preparations will be enough. The horror of his story is watching that faith slowly curdle, realizing too late that the system he helped sell was never going to save anyone except itself. Philosophers at the time too were trying to articulate what this new situation meant. Gunther Anders, for example, wrote about human beings being not yet up to what we have produced. He argued that our moral and imaginative capacities kind of lagged behind our technologies and that we can't even begin to conceive of the hells that we can unleash. Hannah Arendt pointed out that nuclear weapons had created a fundamentally new situation in human history. For the first time, we had the genuine capacity to end civilization entirely. And Jonathan Schell, writing in the 1980s, called it the abolition of man. Not as a metaphor, but as a real technical possibility. Another critic, Susan Sontag, noticed how popular culture was processing this new terror, observing that nuclear war had become a kind of collective fantasy landscape, a way to picture total destruction now that we'd lost faith in those older religious endings. But the thing about nuclear apocalypse is that it demands a kind of huge responsibility without offering the possibility of any sort of closure. And what I mean by that is in the religious version, even the horror had meaning. You know, divine justice, cosmic balance, a new world on the other side. But now, if the world ends, it's just because someone in a bunker made a mistake. There's no satisfaction in that. There's no moral or meaning. There's only the knowledge that this is just another in a long line of stupid things we did to ourselves. And that's psychologically destabilizing in a way that the older apocalypse never was. Because you can't just repent and hope for the best. You have to organize, you have to protest, vote, design treaties, and somehow trust that everyone will do the same. Trusting even the faceless other, the enemy, even. The end of the world becomes a policy problem, one that might be solved or might not, depending on how well a lot of flawed humans manage to coordinate, not a divine being. In Fallout 2, it's very plausibly a problem that just couldn't be solved, and yet it has no meaning beyond that. For a few decades, this fear of the nuclear age was sharp and immediate. People woke up from nightmares about missiles. Children internalized the idea that a bright flash might be the last thing they ever saw. The doomsday clock, it just ticked forward towards midnight, and even Ronald Reagan got scared into arms control and disarmament agreements with the Soviet Union because he saw the nuclear apocalypse in a film called The Day After. And then somehow it didn't happen. The world didn't end, the Cold War did. The Berlin Wall came down and treaties were signed, warheads were dismantled, and the immediate terror of US-Soviet nuclear exchange started to recede. The system worked. Maybe the weapons themselves didn't disappear, of course, but that new Reagan-haunting story that we told ourselves about imminent annihilation, that kind of did. The apocalypse went from today to tomorrow to maybe the next day after that to no, maybe after that to maybe never. By the end of the Cold War, both versions kind of coexisted. The bomb was both too big to think about and too familiar to ignore. It was everywhere and it was nowhere. And when the immediate threat finally lifted a little, we were in a strange inheritance. We had decades of living with the possibility of instant annihilation, now fading into something more like background noise amongst so many other ways we could stupidly end human existence on Earth. We became spoiled for choice in terms of apocalypses. So what happens when you've spent that long under the shadow of the bomb and then the shadow just slightly lifts? Turns out you get used to it. You start making jokes about it, and eventually someone makes it into a video game. So, 1997. The Cold War is over. The Berlin Wall is rubble and souvenirs. The Soviet Union has dissolved into a collection of awkward new flags and economic chaos. And in America, there's a very particular mood, a sense that history has, in some fundamental way, finished. Francis Fukuyama had declared the end of history a few years earlier, arguing that liberal democratic capitalism had won and there was nowhere else for humanity to go politically. No more great ideological struggles, no more existential confrontations between systems, just markets, elections, and incremental improvement forever. It sounds naive now, and no, we're never going to let him forget it, but at the time a lot of people found it plausible, or at least comfortable. And into this moment, peak end of history, pre-9/11, the stock market doing whatever the stock market does, someone releases a video game about nuclear apocalypse. Fallout arrives not during the Cold War, but after it, which turns out to be important because it's not a product of genuine nuclear terror. It's a product of nostalgia for that terror, mixed with a growing unease about what's replaced it. The game looks back at the Cold War aesthetic, the duck and cover drills, the Vault-Tec optimism, the atomic age confidence, and it asks, what if all of that had actually delivered on its worst promise? What if the bombs had fallen and the world that came after revealed that everything was already broken before? Because by 1997, even though the immediate nuclear threat had faded, something else was becoming harder to ignore. The systems that were supposed to deliver us into a better future, the markets, the corporations, the governments, were starting to look less and less like solutions and more like problems in their own right. Climate change was creeping into public consciousness. Financial deregulation was creating bubbles that hadn't burst yet, but felt ominous. I mean, pets.com definitely doesn't feel like it has any parallels to the trillions of dollars currently pouring into AI. The gap between rich and poor was widening, and it's basically never stopped. There was this growing sense that even if the world wasn't going to end in a flash, it might slowly be degrading in ways that no one was willing to stop. And I think this is where the theorist Frederick Jameson becomes useful, because he articulated something that a lot of people were feeling at the time but couldn't quite name. His famous observation that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism sounds like a joke, but it's actually a diagnosis. We can picture asteroid impacts, zombie plagues, nuclear wastelands, alien invasions. Hollywood churns these out by the dozen. But try to picture a genuinely different economic or political system, one that isn't capitalism and also isn't a disaster, and most people's imaginations just stall. Even Fallout itself still has an economy of bottle caps, the Crimson Caravan and the entire New Vegas Strip, same as the old Vegas Strip, but with a tiny bit more cannibalism. Mark Fisher picked up this thread and called it capitalist realism, the sense that capitalism isn't just the dominant system, but the only conceivable one. You might not like it, you might see its flaws, but you can't really picture an alternative that doesn't collapse into something worse. The system becomes like the weather, something you complain about, but assume that you can't change. And this has a strange effect on how we imagine the apocalypse. If the system feels permanent, then the only way to picture it ending is through a total catastrophe. You can't reform your way out, you can only blow it up. Which means apocalyptic fantasies stop being warnings and start becoming, in a weird way, escapist. They're the one place where the machine actually stops. I think Fallout understands this better than almost any other piece of apocalypse fiction, because alongside the good old capitalism, it has other systems and other threats too. There's Caesar's legions, for example, the Enclave, even a medieval knight-type order in the Brotherhood of Steel and the Outcasts. And the pre-war world in Fallout isn't destroyed by an external threat. It's destroyed by the logical endpoint of its own systems. The corporations don't fail to prevent the apocalypse, instead they actively produce it. Resources run out because nobody had an incentive to conserve them, and governments hollow out because corporations captured them. When the end comes, the people who saw it coming aren't trying to stop it. They're trying to profit from it. And okay, a bit of a spoiler warning for the end of season 1 here, so proceed at your own peril. But critically, the TV series makes this explicit in the Vault-Tec boardroom scenes in a way that's kind of only hinted at in the games. We see the executives discussing the coming war not as a tragedy to be averted, but it is a business opportunity to be managed. The implication is not that subtle. It's that Vault-Tec and its corporate partners didn't just prepare for the apocalypse, but helped ensure it would happen. Because a world that ends is a world where their products become essential and their power becomes absolute.
There's a lot of earning potential with the end of the world. But we're talking about making a significant investment based on a hypothetical. How can you guarantee results?
By dropping the bomb ourselves.
That's a way more radical critique than most apocalypse fiction is willing to make. It's not capitalism has failed to save us. It's capitalism worked exactly as designed, and this is what it produced. You can see this everywhere in the Fallout games if you look for it. There are terminals full of corporate memos, cost-cutting decisions that compromise safety, cover-ups of accidents, exploitation of workers who had nowhere else to go. The entire Nuka-Cola Corporation is a dark mirror of real consumer capitalism, selling sugary addiction while its executives retreat to private bunkers, and its head is, well, literally a frozen head still hanging around in Nuka World. Robco and General Atomics churn out robots and weapons, feeding a military-industrial complex that's preparing for a war everybody knows is coming, but nobody can stop. And wandering through the Wasteland, you keep tripping over the ruins of that promise. The billboards still advertising products nobody can buy, for example, or the skeletons in business casual still clinging to their briefcases as if their lives had depended on it. Even the cheerful jingles still playing on a loop 200 years after the audience has died. Importantly for me, this game keeps asking the same question underneath all of the jokes. If this is what the system produced when it was working as intended, then why did we ever trust it with our future? And sure, other post-Cold War apocalypse stories work in similar territory. Snowpiercer imagines a frozen world where the survivors are trapped on a train that's also a rigid class system, the disaster caused by a failed technological fix for climate change, with the aftermath being a brutal hierarchy that claims to be necessary. Or Mad Max Fury Road, or Mad Max in general really, which gives us a wasteland ruled by warlords who control water and oil, the apocalypse being less about nukes than about resource extraction taken to its endpoint. Cormac McCarthy's The Road, for example, which is one of my favourite authors, offers an unspecified catastrophe, but a very specific image of how thin civilization's skin really is and how quickly everything we depend on can disappear and again devolve into cannibalism. These stories aren't about the moment of destruction so much as the systems that made that destruction inevitable, and the systems that emerge from the ruins to replicate the same problems. They're apocalypses of structure, not event, or the slow disasters that we experience dressed up in dramatic imagery, us never learning our lesson. And that's the problem, really. We are, as a species, not great at dealing with slow-moving disasters. We like our apocalypses clear and quick and cinematic. One big event, one villain, and one cathartic ending where hopefully good triumphs over evil. The post-Cold War doesn't give us that. It gives us graphs and reports and headlines and mutually assured destruction and game theory and things that feel like warnings and then become wallpaper. The apocalypse becomes something you could write a risk assessment about, but probably won't. In that context, a setting like Fallout seems almost merciful. It takes all of that slow dread and it turns it into something concrete. The worst has already happened. The graphs have hit their limits. The stock market tanked and the contracts ran out. The vault doors closed. For once, we're not being told that if we just work a bit harder, recycle correctly, and click accept all cookies, everything will be fine. The lie has already failed, so we can stop pretending to believe in it. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If we find relief in imagining that world after the collapse, if the Wasteland feels on some level like a break from the exhausting pretense that everything is working as it should, then what does that say about how we're living now? Because the apocalypse used to be our greatest fear. Then it became a policy and a strategic problem. Then it became background noise. And then somewhere along the way it started to feel almost oozy. So that's where we need to go next. So we've gone from God ending the world to generals ending the world to spreadsheets very slowly ending the world, which leaves us with that uncomfortable question again. If we're this scared and this exhausted, why do apocalypse stories feel good? Because they do. Well, we can dress it up as I just like good writing or it's the aesthetic, but there's something more going on when we happily spend 20 hours or hundreds of hours wandering around a radioactive wasteland for fun. When we clear out a ruined red rocket station and finally meet dog meat and plant some mute fruit or assign some settlers to beds and feel a genuine satisfaction about that. Or even when we tune into Galaxy News Radio just to hear Three Dogs' voice and remember that someone else is still out there, bringing us the truth no matter how bad it hurts. This is where the apocalypse stops being a setting and starts to look more like an atmosphere, if you'll excuse the pun, a very specific kind of comfort that probably says something unflattering about how we're living the rest of our lives. Because there's an old term from the critic Brian Aldiss for a certain kind of British disaster novel that really struck me the other day when I read about it. It's called the cozy catastrophe. The world ends, millions of people die, but the protagonist gets a cottage, a car, and finally some peace and quiet, maybe even a few Monets as well. You know, time enough at last. And the catastrophe clears the slate in just the right way. It's horrible, but it's also kind of nice. Modern cozy catastrophes are a bit less blatant about it. There's the risk and the danger there still, but the pattern is there. We watch The Last of Us or Station 11, Children of Men, Fallout, and somewhere underneath that horror, there's a strange exhale. Like, finally, no emails to clear. Finally, no performance reviews. Finally, no pretending that all of this is sustainable or sane. Just survival. Just clear stakes and the people you trust. In psychological terms, I think it's a retreat from complexity. And I don't mean that as an insult. I think it's just a completely understandable response to the way we're expected to live now. Our actual lives are full of overlapping obligations that never resolve. Work, family, politics, notifications, the economy doing something bad again. All of it stacking on top of each other without any clear way through. There's no single lever to pull and no final boss to defeat unless our own gathering exhaustion counts as a kind of classic RPG shadow boss. It's all systems and probabilities and, well, it's complicated. Whereas an apocalyptic world like Fallout is brutally simple by comparison. You wake up, you're hungry, you're in danger, you find food, you find a gun, you find someone you trust. The stakes are life and death, but they're legible, and you immediately know what matters. There's something deeply appealing about that clarity, even if rationally we know that we wouldn't actually want to live it. Psychoanalysis, too, also has a couple of tools that are useful here, even if we should take them with a heavy grain of irradiated salt. Freud talked about the death drive, a kind of pull towards stillness, an urge to bring tension to an end. Not literal death necessarily, but the desire for things to stop being so relentlessly demanding. The world keeps asking more of us, and some part of us just wants it to stop. Jung, in his more mythic mode, talked in terms of archetypes, of floods, fires, world endings, as images that show up across cultures when people feel that their current order has kind of run out of road. Here, the apocalypse is a sort of collective dream of transformation, with destruction as the precondition for that rebirth, a phoenix rising from the ashes, if you will. Now, neither of these are lab-verified science, but they're more like cultural metaphors, ways of framing the feelings that are hard to articulate directly in this enjoyment. But I think they're also useful for understanding why apocalyptic stories might be doing psychological work for us, why they might let us imagine an ending. Not because we literally want to die, but because we want something to change in a way that feels impossible to achieve through normal means. Slavoj Žižek, for example, has a line about this that I think is worth taking seriously underneath the provocation, even though it is basically stolen from Jameson and others like much of Žižek's work. He points out that disaster movies allow us to imagine global catastrophe more easily than we can imagine modest political changes. We can picture the asteroid, the plague, and the nuclear war, but try to picture, say, a different healthcare system or a genuinely sustainable economy, and the imagination falters. So, of course, the catastrophe starts to look weirdly attractive in fiction, because it's the one place where we're allowed to see the machine actually stop. And Franco Berardi writes about this as a kind of collective exhaustion, what he calls, the slow cancellation of the future. That is the sense that we can't keep up with the acceleration of our systems, paired with the feeling that nothing we do will ever slow them down. We're all running faster and faster just to stay in place, and the future that was supposed to be worth running towards keeps receding from us. Or Byung-Chul Han, who takes this further and talks about the burnout society, which you might have come across, a world where we've internalized every demand, where we police ourselves harder than any boss could, and where we eventually collapse under the weight of our own self-optimization. We're not being exploited by some external tyrant, although perhaps there's a little bit of that, but we're exploiting ourselves because we've been convinced that our value depends on our productivity. Seen through that lens, the cozy apocalypse is less a death wish and more a kind of truant's fantasy. As I've said, a longing to call in sick from a civilization that won't stop calling, to be allowed finally to say no, even if the thing we're saying no to is the entire global order. And Fallout gives us that in a safe fictional container. The bombs have already fallen. We, the audience, are not responsible. We inherit the consequences without having to press the button ourselves. We get to explore the after without owning the before. Foucault might even point out that this is the system winning again, creating a nice little safety valve so that we can all vent and then go back to work. There is, after all, a market for that too. But more than this, Fallout gives us something to do in that aftermath, and I think this is why it works a little better than some of the other grimmer apocalypse fiction, because it's not just about survival. Fallout's also about rebuilding, connection, community, even joy. It's about Shady Sands and Megaton and Diamond City. Or think about settlement building in Fallout 4. Yes, it's a game mechanic, and yes, you can ignore it if you want, but there's something genuinely satisfying about finding a ruined spot in the Wasteland, Sanctuary Hills or the castle or a bombed out drive-in, and slowly turning it into something livable. You clear the debris, you plant crops, build walls, assign jobs. People show up and start living there. They endlessly complain about the beds and the water. And then they get into arguments with each other. It's mundane and it's fiddly and it's weirdly compelling because you can actually see your effort becoming something real. Maybe that's also a little bit of a commentary on bullshit jobs too, but let's set that aside. It's not a fantasy of destruction, actually. It's a fantasy of building, but of building that feels possible because somebody already tore down all of the things that were in the way. And this, of course, makes me immediately think of the companions. Not just Dogmeat, who's, of course, a very good boy and or girl, but all of them. Nick Valentine, the synth detective handling an existential crisis about whose memories he's carrying. Cass getting drunk and delivering bleak wisdom about the state of the world. Or Piper being stubbornly idealistic about truth-telling in a civilization built on lies. These relationships feel earned in a way that it's hard to achieve in ordinary life. You travel together, you fight together, you have conversations that actually go somewhere. They open you up over time and you learn stories, and at some point you realise that you actually care about these fictional people, even Preston Garvey, who keeps telling you that a settlement is under attack, because the apocalypse has stripped away all of the noise and left the only thing that really matters: companionship. The TV show, I think, understands this too. We watch Lucy and Maximus circling each other, suspicious, and then curious, and then getting to something more. We watch moments where strangers help each other for no obvious strategic reason. We watch the ghoul occasionally flicker back into being Cooper Howard for just a second before the Wasteland pulls him back. These are the moments that, for me, make Fallout work best. Not just the violence, not just the horror, but the human stuff that survives along the way. And that, I think, is where the comfort actually sits. Not in the destruction itself, but in the emotional clarity that comes afterwards. The feeling that once everything unnecessary has been stripped away, what's left are the important things: the relationships, the jokes, and the work of keeping each other alive and happy. The problem, of course, is that in real life, we don't get to skip straight to that part. Our apocalyptic fantasies are running alongside a whole bunch of stuff like potential climate breakdown, AI hype and dread, increasingly brittle politics, a cost of living crisis, and a generalised sense that the adults in the room gave up and left years ago. It's very tempting to half joke that we should just start over, let it all burn, move to the woods, live in a small, morally legible community with a shotgun and a veggie patch. But the reason that feels so tempting is exactly why we should be careful with it. When we fantasize about the end, what we're really fantasizing about is the end of certain pressures. The endless productivity grind, or the sense of being permanently monitored and quantified, or the guilt about our carbon footprint, or the knowledge that our comfort probably relies on somebody else's exploitation. Impossible situations. It's not that we secretly want mass death. It's that we can't see a plausible path from here to a saner way of living. So imagination jumps the tracks straight to the ruins. Fallout lets us visit that possibility without having to commit to it. And in doing so, it shows us something useful. That what we're actually yearning for isn't the apocalypse. It's the things that we imagine we could do if the apocalypse cleared the way. So the question becomes, do we actually need the bombs to get there? So, to recap, how did we fall in love with the apocalypse? We started with the religious apocalypse, where the end was God's business and all we could do was wait for judgment. Then came the nuclear age, when we built the bomb and suddenly the apocalypse was in our hands and our responsibility. Terrifying because it demanded action, but offered no meaning if we failed or even succeeded. Then the Cold War ended and the threat went diffuse, fading into the background noise amongst all the other things that we might slowly ruin. And now we're here in the age of the cozy catastrophe, where the end of the world has become familiar enough that we've started to find it almost comforting. That's the space that Fallout lives in. A world where everything's gone wrong, and yet it's weirdly appealing to visit. The games and the show keep us asking the same question underneath all of the jokes. If this is what the system produced when it was working as intended, why do we ever trust it with our future? I think the answer, as I've said, is that Fallout offers us a retreat from complexity. Our actual lives are full of overlapping obligations that never resolve. Work, family, politics, climate anxiety, notifications, economy doing terrible things. There's no single lever to pull and no final boss to defeat, as I mentioned. But the Wasteland is brutally simple by comparison. And the stakes are life and death, but they're legible. We know what matters. And that's where the comfort actually resides. Not in the destruction, but in the emotional clarity that comes afterwards. The feeling that once everything unnecessary has been stripped away, what's left are the important things. Strangely enough, Walton Goggins, who plays the ghoul, has described Fallout as a love story, which sounds weird for a show about nuclear devastation with a startling number of exploding heads. But I think he's right, because underneath it all, it's a story about what is romantic, meaningful, and human in our lives. Connection, loyalty, the stubborn human refusal to stop caring about each other even when caring is inconvenient and probably life-threatening. That's, I think, what we're actually in love with when we fall in love with the apocalypse. Not the ending, but what we imagine might come after. As I've said, a longing to call in sick from a civilization that won't stop calling, so that we can spend some time on the things that truly matter to us. And if we love the apocalypse because it lets us imagine living differently, then maybe the important part isn't the apocalypse at all. It's the living differently part. And we don't need Voltec or a Great War or 2 centuries of radiation to start doing that. The things that keep people going in the Wasteland are loyalty, humour, looking out for each other. These aren't post-apocalyptic virtues. They're just virtues. We can practice them now without having to loot a single ruined super-duper mart in the process. So by all means, enjoy Fallout. I certainly do. Wander the Wasteland and laugh at John Daly's filthy romancing of a chicken. But just remember, it's not the ending that you want. It's the beginning that you're imagining on the other side. And we can start building that now. But that's it for Philosophical TV Club. So until next time, be wise and be kind, and maybe steer clear of Vault 87.